Hello and welcome to another edition of SyrupCast. My name is Daniel Bader, and this week I'm joined by our awesome new contributor, Eric Leamen. How are you?
Oh, I'm good, and I'm blushing now. Thank you for your kind introduction.
Well, you killed it. You did a couple of or three amazing articles to cover the Apple Watch launch, and I thought that was really a cool way to start your your mobile syrup legacy. So we're really lucky to have you. So
Oh, thank you. I'm excited to
yeah,
be contributing to MobileSyrup, especially in the Apple world, because there's a lot of interesting things going on right now that I'm excited about. So the more people I can share that with, the better.
absolutely. And Eric is coming to you black and white for some reason. We haven't figured out why
Yeah.
that is, but if you're watching
I'm
the video,
I've been clicking every button possible in Hangouts trying to find the effects, and I cannot find the effects, so I'm
it's
going to be in
okay.
black and
It's a nice old-timey look. The hair swoop looks particularly good in black and white, I have to
Why,
say.
thank you. I'm upset that people will not be able to appreciate the fluorescent green of my Apple Watch, but
Oh, I was
maybe
wondering if it was green.
it
You
is.
told me that, but it looks white. It looks like
Well,
the
it's totally black and white and gray. So, but it is the green. It is the fluoroelastomer green.
So I guess that's where we should start because Apple Watch has been at the fore of pretty much every outlet's coverage for the last couple of weeks. But you got yours when? On
The
Friday the
24th.
24th?
Yeah, the Friday.
Ah,
Thankfully, I was concerned. The last Apple product that I've ordered online for launch day like that was the 4S, which did not show up until the Monday following launch, and that was one of the longest weekends of my life.
oh.
So I am pleased that my Apple Watch showed up on launch day as it was promised to.
The 4S was the last time that I lined up overnight. That was a very interesting experience because
Hmm.
I guess that was 2011, right?
Yeah.
And we went to me and a friend of the site, Gilbert, who is a longtime friend of mine, and Ian, the owner of MobileSyrup, showed up a bit later. But we went to Sherway Gardens, and it was like October 14th, I think, 2011.
Hmm.
And that night in Toronto, it was cold and rainy, but we got there early enough that we were under the awning just outside of the Sherway Gardens complex. But there were, by like 3, 4 a.m., there were hundreds of people in the rain wearing like ponchos and, making these makeshift tarps. And I mean, I'm always amazed at the dedication of Apple fans, iPhone fans. But
Right.
that year was sort of my first good look at just how hardcore some of them are.
Right. I think they're rivaled only by the insane fangirls that follow the boy bands and such around the country, you know?
I've still like, I mean, I've admitted, like, I admit that, like, if I am in an elevator and, a celebrity, like, if Charlize Theron walked into an elevator and I was just like standing there, I would be awestruck for sure.
Oh yeah.
But like the whole notion of following, and I've done this. I've gone down the Twitter rabbit hole with some of these fangirls and boys too, where when Zayn from One Direction announced that he was leaving, I tapped on his Twitter account, and every single tweet of his, even if it was as banal as a smiley face, just a smiley face hanging in midair. There's no context, nothing else. He would get like 150,000 retweets
Hmm.
and so many, like countless thousands of replies of
Hmm.
people just like devoting themselves and prostrating themselves at his feet. And I just don't understand it. I mean, it's something that clearly has, like, you have a physiological reaction to this, but it doesn't make sense.
It's a strange kind of power that they wield.
It's true. It is true. I don't pretend to understand it, but that said, I am often in the thralls of technological awe, awe. We'll just leave that as it is, awe. And I was going to say awesomeness, but awesomeness is basically just awe.
Exactly. Expanded.
Elaborated. As I
No,
try to.
technological awe. I think that's a thing, right?
Oh, for sure. And I mean, a lot of Apple users justify their kind of early adopter status by being in that enthrall. They want to be early adopters because they want to be in awe before everybody else.
Right.
So okay, so you ordered yours on the 10th. What
Yes.
time? Like, did you get up at 3 in the morning and order it?
Of course I did. I set my alarm for 2:55. I was tri-wielding, I guess you would say. I had my phone, I had my iPad, I had my laptop. I was refreshing the store on everything like mad.
Okay.
And my iPad let me in, I think, just before 3:01.
So you were doing it in the Apple Store app or
Yes.
in Safari? Okay.
Well, I had the store open in Safari on my Mac, and I was using the Apple Store app on my phone and my iPad, which is one of the best kept secrets for Apple launch mornings, pre-order mornings. The store app tends to hold up better than the store website.
So this is what I've heard, and this year I actually tried that strategy. In years past, I've been burned by using Chrome during launch events, and then I realized that Apple, I don't know if it's inadvertent, but Chrome does not like launch events. It doesn't update fast enough or something. But eventually, I would always get into Safari at like 3:01 or 3:02, and it would be fine. But this time, Safari wasn't even working on my Mac, so I decided, okay, here's what I'll do. I'll open my watch. I'll open my favorite, because I'd had my favorite on the iPhone app, and that was it. That's all I needed.
Yeah. I mean, the web store, that's the other thing, is that the App Store app tends to come back online a lot quicker than the web store does. Mind you, this entire experience was a far cry from the iPhone 6 when that went available for pre-order. That was supposed to be at 3 a.m. and I was still sitting awake at 4:30, unable to get into the Apple Store. Needless to say,
now
I
we
was
know
not
why.
very happy that morning.
Like we know that the iPhone 6 has just like completely destroyed any semblance of analyst estimates, right? Like 75 million in this first quarter, 61 million in the second quarter just released. I think there were a few days of Q4 where the iPhone did sell, right?
The iPhone 5 or the 5, right?
Like it was released on September 21st, if I'm not mistaken, and the end of the quarter was September 30th.
They usually do that. The major product launch is usually just a couple of days or a week before the end of their quarter.
Yeah, and I mean, we'd have to get somebody with a more financial background to know, to kind of explain this. But wouldn't they want the entirety of their new stock to be reported in the first quarter, when clearly that's when they have their record revenues?
Well, it doesn't seem like that's really affected them so far. I mean, they continue to report like blockbuster. It's usually, the quarter following the new iPhone launch or the watch launch or whatever it is, usually ends up being the huge. Well, I mean, it's the holiday quarter too. So, I actually don't know whether they include the opening day sales in the end of that current quarter, or whether that all counts towards the next one. I don't know. I mean,
I guess they could choose to report, even though they would, they came out with a press release on the Monday after the launch, and they said that they had 10 million pre-orders. But it was September 9th, I think, that it went on sale, and then, or for pre-order, and then September 19th it went on sale in the stores. I'm getting the 5S and the 6 confused, but I'm too lazy to look it up.
I don't blame you.
Whatever. So regardless, they sold hundreds. I mean, just a ridiculous number of iPhones. And a lot of people said that this was a long time coming, because all they needed to do was really increase the size of the phones and everybody would follow suit.
Right.
But I don't think it was that simple. I think that the iPhone 6 was it was just a confluence of everything, right? It came down to Yes, it was a bigger size, but a lot of people were coming out of 2 and 3 year contracts. I mean, 2 years in the States, and in Canada it's 3 years, but now they've shifted to 2. But a lot of my friends who bought 6s were in a position where they were either on the verge of coming out of their 3 year contracts from the iPhone 4S in 2011, or they just paid up the difference, right? And and felt like it was easy. It was worth, paying $50 or whatever in an early cancellation fee to get their new phone.
Well, it was kind of this like perfect storm of, they finally did the bigger screen sizes. They were releasing it at a time when a lot of Americans were just coming out of their contracts on the Galaxy S3, right? Which was kind of Samsung's biggest, was when Samsung really exploded, right? That was when the Galaxy sort of really took off.
Right.
So it's been honestly crazy to watch. I mean, I never expected that just them making a bigger phone was going to have this much of an impact. But you see, like, quarter over quarter, they're selling like 60, 70 million of these things. You have to assume a lot of those people are Android switchers. There's not a ton of people that are just getting into the iPhone for the first time anymore.
And Tim Cook said in Q1, he said in the earnings call that it was like 80% switchers. It was a very small number upgrading from earlier iPhones.
Right.
And, the 65 or 70, 74 million iPhones sold in Q1 2015, which comprised the 3 months between October 1st and December 31st. You have a lot of Android users basically fed up with their clunking Galaxy S3s. You're right. And they wanted something new, and they wanted to invest in the Apple ecosystem. Yeah. But I mean, flip side too, when I know a lot of iPhone users switched over to the Galaxy S4 when it came out in 2012 because they weren't really happy with the iPhone 5. Or they weren't happy with the iPhone 4S. The Galaxy S5, the Galaxy S4 came out before the iPhone 5 in about 6 months earlier. But I think that the 4S wasn't as big an upgrade as some people wanted, and they opted to go Android because I think by then Samsung had kind of gained enough momentum that people found them to be a compelling alternative.
Yeah. Well, that was kind of, I mean, I was feeling the same way back then. I mean, I went through a period where I got a couple of different Android phones within the span of 2 years because I was starting to feel like the iPhone and iOS was getting really stale. So I got an Nexus 4. I played with that for a while. I got a Moto X. I played with that for a while. But recently with Apple doing, iOS 7, iOS 8, the iPhone 6, like they've gotten back to an exciting place. I think they've stopped. They've done bigger increments, I guess, between the iPhones now. Right. And that's apparently paying off for them. I mean, you see it working in China, in other Asian countries where the 6 and 6 Plus have been the most popular iPhones that have ever been released, as far as we can tell. Apple's been putting a larger focus on China recently, and clearly they need to. And clearly, what they're doing with the iPhones and stuff has been working there. So,
I mean, their acquiescence to the Chinese carriers has been a big part of that revenue shift, right? I think in Q2, they announced that for the first time, more of their revenue was derived from China than from the United States, which is enormous. I mean, if they had a $62 billion quarter, and I think it was that more of their iPhone revenue was made in China than it was in the States. But they don't break down the number of phones sold in each country. They just break it down by revenue. But you can assume that because the infrastructure in China has been improving, they've sort of China Mobile has like 400 or 500 million users. And with a growing middle class, you have a lot more people that are willing to take on that enormous expense. Because an iPhone in China is not cheaper than an iPhone in Canada or the States. It's still a $700-800 phone. It's just that people are prioritizing these purchases differently.
Yeah. So it's interesting, actually, on that topic. I've been wondering lately whether A few weeks back, I think it was around the time that the watch went available for pre-order. Apple raised the price of the iPhone 6 and 6 Plus here in Canada. And I've been wondering if that's going to have any sort of effect on sales going forward. I mean, if we assume the next models that come out this year are going to be priced slightly higher, because that's something I always hear from people, is that the reason they choose Android or the reason they choose BlackBerry or Windows Phone is because of the price, right? There's this kind of stigma that iPhones are expensive, which is in some cases true, in other cases not true. I mean, a Galaxy S6 or an S6 Edge can be just as expensive or even more expensive than an iPhone. So I'm curious to see if that's going to have any negative effect on their sales going forward or their growth in any of these countries, or if people are going to just pay up for the experience.
So, I mean, I can only speak to Canada, but the shift was entirely due to the poor Canadian dollar versus the US dollar. So that exchange rate affected only iPhones, because it's my understanding that Apple began charging the carriers more for the phones themselves. And in order not to have to raise subsidies by another $100 to $200, they shifted the price to make the subsidy amount the same, which is, I think, $480 for each iPhone. Now you're right. There are Samsung phones that are more expensive than some of the cheaper iPhones. But now looking at the lineup, it's clear that the Samsung Galaxy S6 is significantly cheaper than even the entry-level iPhone 6. So, you have a Galaxy S6, which has 32 gigs of storage for 250 Canadian. And the entry-level iPhone 6 is now 350 Canadian. So it's a full $100 more for what a lot of people are going to perceive as less value. Right. I think there are two things at play here. One, most iPhone customers who were looking into buying a phone at 250 are still going to buy a phone at 350. But there's also that subset of people who are going to be convinced by a CSR, many of whom are incentivized to sell a certain brand, right? So you have Samsung, HTC, LG, they're all pushing these salespeople to sell their products. They're giving them commissions in some way. So you can imagine, John at Rogers, who's selling you a phone. You come in looking for an iPhone 6. It's got a curved, glass display. It's got metal. It's got, the beautiful iPhone kind of sales pitch, great marketing. It's got its own little kiosk there. And John says to, you or me, listen, I see that you're looking for a 16 gig iPhone 6. It's $350. I mean, it's a lot of money to spend up front. Let me show you the Galaxy S6. You know Galaxy, right? It's made by Samsung. This year's model, it's way improved. It's got metal. It's got curved glass. It's got way more storage. And listen, I'm going to tell you, I trust me here. Android's improved a lot. Lollipop's gotten a lot better. I'm like, what's Lolly? Okay, whatever. Like, let's try it. Sure. Yeah. And I think that's sort of the interplay here, is that there are people who aren't going to care that there's a $400 or $500 iPhone that, is significantly more expensive than it was a month ago. But then there's going to be a significant piece of the population that's going to acquiesce to the salesperson, or kind of get convinced one way or the other and be like, okay, sure, why not? I heard Samsung's pretty good. And it's the pretty good that's going to get a lot of people. So,
yeah, and it's interesting. I think maybe I'm just bitter that the prices are more expensive now. Totally. My wallet's going to be a little lighter.
Yeah, and I mean, so when are you due for an upgrade?
Well, I'm on this interesting kind of, I guess I would say, warpath right now, where I'm kind of trying to get away from buying my phones on a contract, and I prefer to buy them outright from Apple, just for the sake of being able to have it unlocked, being able to use it when I travel. Maybe that plan's going to have to change if I can't afford an $800 phone at the end of the year. But it just with everything that's gone on with the plan pricing in Canada recently, and I have a really great plan right now that I've had for almost 5 years. That was an old 3-year plan that once my contract is up, I don't know what's going to happen to that. So,
Well, it's not going to come back. I mean, you're not going to be able to use it again.
well, exactly. And so that's my fear.
All
and
the
that's almost,
carriers are forcing their share plans. So,
right. And I don't want to have to switch. I don't want to have to give up my plan. So that's kind of why I want to break away from the carriers and sort of, fight the power and stick it to the man, but we'll see what happens there.
I mean, in one sense, it's actually quite a good thing that the price of the phones are becoming disintegrated with the price of the plans. And I mean, a lot of the flanker brands like Fido and Kudo are moving in this direction where you, instead of getting a subsidy, you finance your phone over 2 years, but you pay a portion of that every month until the phone is paid off.
Right.
And then at the end of 2 years, the price of the phone drops off the end of your plan, and you have a cheaper plan, right? So you have an $80 plan, $20 a month for your phone. 24 months later, you're paying $80, not $100. Now, it's good in some ways because it's educating the Canadian population that phones are actually quite expensive. I don't think many people realize that when they get a $0 phone, they're actually many times buying a $500-$600 phone.
Right. They think phones cost $200, $99, whatever it is. They don't realize that they actually cost $700, $800, $900, sometimes over $1,000, depending on which one you pick. Right.
Yeah. And I mean, I was talking to a journalist I was in San Francisco this week for Build, and I was talking to a guy who said that he and his wife were at a music festival, and she had misplaced her iPhone 5, and it was a couple years old at this point, but it was a bit worse for the wear. She dropped it a few times, but it was working.
Mm-hmm.
And she left it, back in the field, and she was like, you know what, screw it. We're carrying all these things. I'm due for a phone upgrade anyway. And he was like, no, this is not some $200 phone that you're leaving on the grass somewhere.
Exactly.
This is a $700 product. If you wanted to sell this thing tomorrow, you could, we could pay half a month's rent for this.
Right.
And he had to explain to his wife that the phone that she got for $200 from AT&T was actually a $750 iPhone.
Right.
And, my job as somebody who works in this industry has been to try to educate people on that stuff. But I mean, it's really hard to get through to people.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's hard enough to explain just how to go about buying a phone and getting a plan, never mind the intricacies of, what goes on behind the scenes and how everything is set up. And yeah, it's confusing. We only understand it because we're the nerdy, it's our job. This is the hobby that we've chosen, the passion that we've chosen. So it's also our kind of curse that we have to deal with some of these things.
It's 100% a curse, but it's also, I have the privilege of helping everybody in my family, privilege/curse of helping everybody in my family pick phones because, I'm able to suggest the right phones for them. And I feel like I do a better job of a rather than somebody at a Rogers or Bell store who looks at them for 2 minutes and go, okay, I'm going to try to sell them this obscure Android phone that they're going to hate.
Yeah.
So,
totally.
I'm a bit more sort of in the Android camp than you are, I think. I live in both worlds. I live with my iPhone in one pocket and an Android in another. And that's because in many ways I have to, because it's my job, but also I really like Android. I think that there are advantages to Android that iOS just can't really hit yet.
Mm-hmm.
I think the notifications on Android are still far better than they are on iPhone. But I think that when you talk to somebody, when you talk to a layman, they expect you to be in one camp or the other.
Right.
There's little subtlety to an argument. And, I'm sure you heard about that fight that broke out between roommates a couple of weeks ago in some city in the US because one Android guy was telling one iPhone guy to go fuck himself, and there was a big fight, and it got all over the press.
These are the kind of things where I wish I could just sit people down and just be like, look, everyone, let's chill. Why can't we just all get along? No, nobody's right or wrong, like, and this has come up recently. So it's interesting that you bring up this point. Like, everyone expects you to be in one camp, because this totally happens to me all the time. People will ask, oh, I need to get a new phone. What phone should I get? Oh, I bet you're going to say iPhone, right? Like, of course, that's the only option. And for me, yes, I prefer the iPhone, but I always say to them, like, no, like, there are great Android phones out there. There are some great Windows phones out there. Like, it's whatever works for you. Like, let's figure out what works for you. What do you want from your phone? What's going to be the best one for you? Maybe it will be the iPhone. Maybe it will be an Android phone, right? Like, just because I go back to iOS, I prefer iOS day to day, doesn't mean I don't understand the merits and the benefits of another platform.
Totally.
And this has come up again recently with the watch. A lot of Android people are saying, why are all these Apple fans getting so excited about the watch? This isn't the first smartwatch. This, it does everything Android Wear can do and all this kind of stuff. And sure, that's true to some extent, but it's also, for Apple people, this is the first Apple Watch, right? Like, this is people that are using iPhones that are interested in Apple don't use Android. They don't know Android watches exist in some cases. So of course there's going to be this excitement because it's the first one from Apple. It's the first one that's going to work the best with the iPhone. But again, it's not something to fight over, everybody. Like, everyone can have their preference, right? You can like more than one thing. You don't have to fit into some camp.
Right. But I think the watch is also an interesting example of this, bifurcation of what's happened with the smartphone industry, is that in many ways, Android users understand iPhone and iPhone users understand Android, because the smartphone is inherently a useful tool. I don't think anybody would ever dispute that having a smartphone is an advantage over not having one, and that regardless of platform, it proffers huge advantage in your daily life. I don't think that even if I was using a BlackBerry Bold 9900, I would still gain huge advantage over somebody else using a flip phone. I mean, that is, I think, an objective statement that you can make in 2015. But with the watch, I think people are still looking at it as a dalliance. I think, and in many ways it is, it's not something that anybody needs. And I think from the ardent, Android fanboy to the John Grubers, I don't think anybody would dispute that. I don't think anybody's going to look at a smartwatch and go, just because Apple's making this, you need one.
Right.
And I think that's being lost in translation from many of the reviews.
No, I completely agree with that. And actually, I mean, John Gruber had a great piece this week about how really with the Apple Watch and any smartwatch in general, what it boils down to is, like, it's still just a watch. And I think in this argument, we can throw in, fans of traditional analog watches, right? People that just like wearing a watch for its function or its beauty rather than, wearing a smartwatch. What it boils down to with the Apple Watch is, do you think it's a nice looking watch that you want to wear? It doesn't necessarily matter, does it do this better than an Android watch, or what's it going to do for your life that an analog watch isn't going to do? It's just, do you think it's a nice watch, and do you want to wear one? Right? No one needs a $500, $600, $10,000 watch. Just the same way that no one needs a $50 Casio, right? Like, these are things that you buy for their fashion value, for their, the way it makes you feel, the way it makes you look. So it's the same kind of thing. And yeah, I think we've gotten into this hole where we're looking at it in terms of its functions and its features, and we're looking at it too much like a traditional gadget. And there doesn't have to be an answer to, do you need one? Because I think the answer is no. Like, you don't need one, right? It's a luxury. It's an accessory.
And again, that word accessory, it is defined by not having a central place. It's an accessory to something else. Mm-hmm. And just like I like to invest in nice smartphone cases, or I like to invest in the occasional sort of, I'm just looking around at all the gadgets I have, and I'm like, okay, let's look at this. This is the HTC Re. It's a little kind of camera that nobody would think that they want, right? Like, it doesn't have a screen. It has really little immediate value. But when I use this thing in certain situations, it is far more useful than my smartphone camera. Right? You know, I can attach it via Bluetooth to my phone. I can hold my phone in front of me. I can, you know, hold the Re up here, and I can get some really interesting shots. No casual smartphone user is going to go, man, I need a HTC Re.
Mm-hmm.
But it's also one of those things where if you buy it and it makes you really happy because you're a photography geek and you really want to get everything possible that will make your photo taking experience better, I say go for it. I say spend that $200. And it's the same with the watch. I'm not sure that anybody right now should go out and spend $1,400 on a stainless steel Apple Watch with a Link bracelet, right? Unless that's what you were going to go out and buy from Tag or Rolex or, you know, one of these other companies. And I think if you go into it looking like, okay, instead of buying one of those watches, I'm going to buy an Apple Watch instead, I don't think you're going to be unhappy. I think you're actually going to be quite surprised at how much better the experience is.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah,
it's been such a divisive product, right? Like, and it has certainly drawn a lot of attention to the category, just simply for the fact that it's Apple, right? It's Apple's entry into, I mean, like it or not, when Apple does something, people are going to pay attention to it, even if Google did it first or Samsung did it first, or, you know, Rolex did it first hundreds of years ago, right? Like people are talking about it because it's Apple now. But I really do think we've just gotten clouded in this thinking of like, why do I need one? Why do I need one? Because it's the kind of product where you don't need one. No one has ever needed a watch, right? It's totally one of those luxury things. And people try to argue now, like, you need a phone. And like you said, it does have some large tangible benefit when you carry around a smartphone all day. And no, the watch doesn't have that kind of immediate, like, life-changing feature or benefit at all like the smartphone does. But and that's why it's so interesting to me, is because it is such a different device for these technology companies to be working on. And it's so interesting and kind of funny to see the tech press reacting to it. And even everyday people. I mean, I've enjoyed going to the Apple Store and seeing non-nerds in there looking at the watch and trying them on and buying them. Like, it's been really fascinating.
So, I mean, let's talk about that. What has been your I guess you've had it for just over a week now.
Yeah.
Today's Saturday, right?
Yeah. So it's been just over a week.
Just over a week. So what are your first impressions of the watch?
I mean, so far, so immediately, I mean, I love the hardware. It's typical Apple, like, everything is polished, it's clean, it's so well built, like, everything about it is really great. Software wise, obviously there are bugs. It's a first generation product, right? There are things that need to be ironed out, things that could be better, things that seem a little rushed or not fully thought out or not fully baked. But overall, I've really liked it. I mean, I don't have a ton of notifications turned on for things. I've been very conservative with what sends me notifications, what interrupts me during the day, and even more so on the watch. I don't even have everything that comes to my phone also come to the watch. I've been very kind of trying to cut down on all that stuff. But it has been useful in that sense of just being able to quickly glance, is this something that needs to interrupt this meeting that I'm in or this task that I'm doing, or is this something I can ignore for a little while? I will say it is a little frustrating to not always be able to act on notifications from your wrist, depending on what app it is that's pinging you, or what kind of, you can't reply to an email. For example, you can answer a phone call or reply to a text message, but there are just certain things that you can't do on the watch. I will say one of the features that I've really enjoyed, that I've actually used every day since I've gotten it, has been the activity tracking and the workouts and the fitness features, which I've never experienced that sort of gamification of exercise before. Mm-hmm. And so just being able to, at a glance, see how much you've moved, how much you've exercised, how much you've stood throughout the day has been really useful in just kind of making me focus on that a little bit more, actually paying attention to how much exercise you're getting throughout the day. Yeah. And the little, as corny as they look, the little badges and rewards that you get when you hit a certain goal, like it does motivate you to try to, I want to hit my move goal 7 days this week to get this little badge. And I want to go out for a walk, and I'm not just going to sit around and, waste the day away. That I think has been the biggest benefit so far in my week with it. That's the thing that it's affected most in my life. So that's been really great.
I wonder how much of a strategy it was to release it just as the weather is getting better in some parts of the US and Canada. I mean, obviously that was not a main goal for them, but they're in Cupertino, right? Like Northern California is pretty much nice all year round, but you wonder whether people would have had the same immediate satisfying experience using the watch's fitness tracking if they were holed up in a gym, all day doing it, right?
Because I mean, that's the original. From what we've heard, at least, they originally wanted to release it in the fall, like closer to when they actually announced it back in September. I do agree with you. I think it would have been weird if I had gotten this thing in October, just as it was starting to get cold, it's starting to snow, like I wouldn't be going outside as much. Like, I don't think I would have noticed this kind of benefit. Like, the weather's nice enough now where I can actually use these features, rather than being, like you said, holed up in a gym or something like that, where you don't quite get the full experience of how you can use this thing. So I don't know necessarily whether they planned specifically to launch it in the spring for that purpose. People are wanting to go out and exercise. It's just, it's just after the holidays. Everyone's been sitting around all winter. They want to get out. They want to do things. Maybe they're even interested in going and buying a device to augment that experience, right? Like, I don't know how much they planned that, but I'm certain that they're happy to benefit from it for sure.
And I think, with Fitbit, what's interesting about this is, okay, so, my interaction with devices with heart rate monitors has been basically Android Wear was the first one that was the first platform that I used that's really supported it in great, with great scale, right? So we have the Moto 360 has one, the G Watch, and no, not the G Watch. Yeah, the G Watch R. Most of the Android Wear watches do, and the recent versions of devices like the Basis Peak, the Fitbit Surge, and Charge HR. This generation of devices all have these trackers that don't deplete your battery like they did back in a couple of years ago. So with the Basis Peak and the Charge HR, or the Fitbit Surge, these devices are actually measuring your heart rate the entire time you're wearing them. So it gives you a much more granular measurement scale. But the Apple Watch does better than the Android Wear ecosystem in that it takes a measurement of your heart rate every 5 minutes, whereas Android Wear is only on demand. And it's pretty much unreliable because when you want to do it, when your heart rate's at its peak, you can't get a good measurement because you're running and you need to stop, slow down, and explicitly ask for it to take your heart rate.
Right.
So Apple's actually found the best of both worlds in this strategy, I think.
Right. And the interesting, or the way that Apple's approached it, at least, I think, is from their typical kind of mass market viewpoint, right? Like, a lot of people have been wondering, how accurate are these things? They're not. It's not tracking, the Apple Watch in particular. It's not tracking as constantly as something like a Fitbit might, or but I think it's enough. It does enough, and it does it well enough to just give you that kind of snapshot. And I mean, they've said that their goal is to get you to live a better day, right? Live a healthier life. Like, the fitness features on the Apple Watch is at least enough to get normal people interested in that thing. And I just to get a glance of how active am I being, how, maybe it's not as accurate as a chest worn heart rate tracker or anything like that. Right. But it's interesting and intriguing enough to get normal people thinking about it, at least, which I think is Apple's goal. And I think they've succeeded on that really, really well. And just the way that it's presented with the circles that fill in throughout the day. And it's just such an easy to understand system that I think it's really well done.
Yeah, and I mean, what's interesting is Apple's been pushing its collaboration with Christy Turlington Burns,
Hmm.
who ran the London Marathon and blogged about her preparation for it. Clearly a marketing strategy, but one that will definitely appeal to long distance runners.
Yeah.
But I also read an interesting piece by Greg Ferenstein or Gregory Ferenstein in, I believe it was Read Write. And what he said was that, he's an ultra kind of a CrossFit enthusiast, long distance runner, but he also does a lot of interval training. And he found that the Apple Watch just isn't really made for that stuff. It's not designed for multiple types of working out. It's not really designed to get more granular information from other sources, right? So
Right.
you can have several things uploading information to Apple Health at the same time, but you need to be wearing multiple pieces of hardware to do that.
Right.
So, Apple Watch is clearly, it's as a first generation product goes, it is, as you said, aiming at that broad consumer base. And it's not really focusing on the ultra hardcore athletes, just like it's not focusing on sort of trying to do everything really well. It's just trying to do a few things really well. And eventually, like most Apple products, it'll scale up over time.
Well, exactly. And I mean, they've put such an emphasis on, they hired Jay Blahnik, right? They've got scientists and doctors that are working at Apple now. They showed photos and video of this lab that they've been running with people, testing different sensors and just having people exercising all day long and keeping track of all of that. So clearly it's on their radar, right? It's something they want to pack more sensors and better sensors into this thing for future generations. And I have no doubt that, by Apple Watch 5 or 6 or whenever it is that, you'll be able to do more, or these serious athletes will be able to have a greater benefit from something like the Apple Watch. But I think for a first generation product, when you compare it to, and again, I have not spent any substantial time with Android Wear, but I think when you compare it to what's out there, even, the screenless fitness trackers that you wear, I think the Apple Watch at least matches, if not exceeds those by a little bit, which I think is impressive, at least just for the first generation.
Right. And so one thing that Ferenstein complained about was that, like most heart rate monitors that use the pulse oximeter technique, which shines a green light through your skin and detects the pulses in your bloodstream and then sends that information back. It takes a while for the information to catch up to the Apple Watch. So what he said was that he used a polar mobile heart rate strap over his chest, which is much more accurate. And he found that while Apple Watch would eventually catch up, it didn't get there fast enough, so that he would maintain a higher heart rate on the polar for a longer period than the Apple Watch did. So the sort of, if you take the Apple Watch readings every few minutes, they're usually fairly accurate. But over the course of a day or the course of a workout, it's not going to scale as accurately or as robustly as the traditional kind of heart rate monitor. But obviously, that's not true. Like clearly, Apple is not pushing people to replace their polar mobile chest straps with an Apple Watch.
No, I mean, if you're that hardcore into it, right, of course you're going to have to use serious equipment, right? That's all my point is, like, if you're someone who jogs or runs or goes to the gym, but you're not a professional athlete or someone working in health sciences or something like that, the watch is enough to give you a Snapchat and to give you snapshot. And some motivation and a good look at what you're doing, right? It's just enough to get an understanding and a look at how the exercise that you're doing is affecting your life, right? If you want that granular data, of course, you're going to have to use like professional, expensive equipment, and I don't think that's going to change, maybe ever, right? Like this is a mass market; it's a consumer product, so. Whether they'll be able to jam in all of the functionality of a chest strap heart monitor at some point, that would be impressive. But who knows if it's possible at this scale?
But I mean, should they even be doing that? And
and that's the bigger question. Yeah.
because on the one hand, future generations of Apple Watches will clearly have upgraded internals and more sensors and better software. But at the end of the day, I don't think the marketing strategy for the watch will ever deviate that far from it being a timepiece first and foremost.
Exactly. These are kind of supplementary features, right? They're the nice things to have, but again, it does boil down to it's a timepiece, it's a nice piece of jewelry that you wear, and it does this health tracking stuff as an added benefit.
And also, Apple's never shied away from partnering with companies that it believes in too. So, for example, the things you can't if you install an iPhone out of the box, just like an Android phone or anything, you can't really do a whole lot. I mean, you can browse the web, you can take notes, you can make phone calls, send text messages, you can check stocks and weather and whatever. But ultimately, the robustness of the experience comes from the App Store itself. And Apple's not made any bones about how it plans to bring native apps to Apple Watch later. Because right now, the third-party app experience on the watch is it's a big letdown, in my opinion. It's not really giving me the experience that I thought it would.
Yeah. Just on that last point about health, I mean, there's already the option to connect the watch to a Bluetooth heart rate monitor. So they do give you the option to connect those kind of devices. I do think that it's more likely that you'll see more devices and more companies being able to feed their data into the watch, either through Research Kit or Health Kit or things like that, right? I think that's the way that you'll be able to connect to these more serious professional kind of trackers and devices rather than it all being built into the watch.
Right.
So on the point of apps, there's a lot of them so far, but I do agree with you. I think the experience has been lackluster, and I don't know whether that's just because of the limitations of WatchKit and sort of the first generation development platform for this thing, or whether it's because developers did not have access to a watch while they were building their apps. I mean, I think maybe it's a combination of both. There's not a ton that you can do with WatchKit right now. There are limits to how fast your app can be because you are pulling most of the UI and information from the phone. And I think those are the little things that will change once native apps arrive. Like you'll be able to load things from the watch rather than having to pull it all from the phone. But I've actually been pleasantly surprised by how many developers seem to understand the kinds of experience that you would want on a watch, not a full-fledged like Twitter app or a full detailed weather app. Like the apps that are out there right now seem to, at least a lot of them, seem to understand that it's the 5 to 10 second interactions, maybe even shorter, the glanceable kind of things that you want. And the only downside has been sort of the speed of the apps, which will get better hopefully by the end of the year.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not taking issue with the apps themselves. Some of them are better at giving you what I think should be a smartwatch experience. For example, I love the New York Times implementation of one sentence news stories. I think that they're doing a fantastic job at that. They're giving me just enough bullet points that I feel like I've taken something away, and then hand off, making it easy to look on the phone to follow up. But it is mostly just the speed at which these apps open. And I've read a bunch of developer articles. David Smith wrote a really interesting one where he created 4 template apps, blank apps.
I love this.
Yeah, and I mean, I'll link to it in the show notes because it's really worth reading if you're interested in how watch apps are developed. But basically, Apple's given developers a bunch of templates that they can use, a table, different formats of displaying information. And he was saying that none of them open more slowly than the others. It's basically how you prioritize the pull of information to your watch. And I mean, some of the apps like Circa that give you a logo, even while it's loading, make you feel less anxious about the idea that the app is not showing you anything yet. So a lot of the apps that in my opinion fail to be compelling are the ones where you just see the name of the app and then a spinning wheel, right? At least if you show me something, show me that you're working on something, that 5 to 10 second delay is not going to be as painful for me.
Right. And that has been one of the pieces that I wrote on MobileSyrup was about the kinds of apps that I think are great for the wrist and the kinds of experiences that I was excited to try. One of them being Overcast. So I was excited at the prospect of being able to keep my phone in my pocket while I'm on the streetcar or the subway, but still be able to pick a new podcast or skip forward and backward. I mean, you can do that with your headphone little clicky remote thing, but being able to choose a new episode or pick a different show or whatever on your wrist, to me was compelling and exciting. But I've already gotten to the point where Overcast takes so long to load, or the watch turns off before I'm able to even see a UI, that it's just, I've already, a couple of times tried to load Overcast on the watch, waited a few seconds, just been like, screw it, and pulled my phone out of my pocket, right?
Yeah.
And that's the kind of thing that I'm trying so hard. I try to load Transit or City Mapper or Overcast or Carrot Weather or something on the watch, because I'm like, I don't want to have to take out my phone. I want so badly to be able to do this on my wrist. And then it just doesn't do it fast enough. I mean, the apps themselves are good and the ideas behind them are good. It's just, I think, the limitations of this development platform at this point.
Yeah, and I mean, it's sad that we have to say eventually, or maybe even in the near future, these problems will be overcome. But at the moment, as an early adopter, these are very real problems. And I agree with you. I mean, of all the developers who created smart Apple Watch apps, Marco Arment is probably one of the best in diagnosing what a sort of dialed down experience of one of his apps should be. I mean, the dude's been making great apps for forever, right? To fit certain screen sizes. Yeah. And I can imagine that he's agonizing over how long his app is taking to load.
Well, he's already said, I think the first day that he had his watch, he tweeted out that, don't get too attached because I'm completely rewriting Overcast for the watch and I want it to be one of the fastest apps that loads on your watch, and I can't stand the way it works right now. And so he's publicly said that he cannot stand his own app on the watch, which I think is a good thing, because I think it's good for developers to feel that way and to try to fix it. I don't know how much he can do within this current landscape with these current tools, the way that everything works, to make it better. I'm sure there are certain things, right? But we've seen that it's not necessarily pulling UI that is slowing things down. It's the way that you're pulling the data. So sure. I think there's going to be a lot of developers feeling the same way, though. I mean, now that they're starting to get their watches and they can actually use their apps on a day-to-day basis, hopefully things will improve. Hopefully they'll have time to think of, how can I optimize my app to send the data faster, send the data in a better order, maybe switch up the way that the screens work so that you've got time to load the second screen while users are on the first screen, things like that, right? That can change. And with WWDC coming up in a couple of weeks, maybe we'll see more about the native apps on the watch. It'd be really nice if those do arrive sometime this year. I'll keep my fingers crossed, but we'll have to see.
Yeah, I mean, I've been reading sort of. I mean, the big players in the Apple Watch or in the Apple development space have all said that this is going to take time. And you interviewed a bunch of people for your piece, and some of the takeaways were that look at it not necessarily like, or at least look at the Apple Watch ramp up not like the iPad, where even though it was a different screen size, they still were able to use and leverage a lot of what the iPhone tools gave developers at the time. They're basically writing these things from scratch. I mean, there was zero, there were almost no precedents for this.
Right.
Apple created WatchKit as a completely different SDK and set all of these limitations that I'm sure longtime iOS developers have battled with and been very pleased with the direction that iOS has gone in. But at the end of the day, right, like this is still Apple going, this is all we can give you right now, guys. Like, take it or leave it.
Yeah. And the nice thing to hear from developers was that they were happy to have this, at least, right? I mean, Apple with the first iPhone, there was no way to build apps. Eventually they said, try web apps. And developers were like, that's garbage. And then eventually Apple did give them a full SDK. So at least this time, Apple has gone out of their way to say, like, okay, look, we've built these tools so that you can start making apps. You can get your services and your apps onto people's watches. Like, you can start this process. we're going to make it better in the future, but at least for now, like, here are some tools to start with. And developers are grateful for that. And to hear at least that they're all optimistic about the future, they want to be developing for this platform. They want to make their apps better. They're excited about the possibilities that this device is going to bring. That is nice to hear, at least, that they're, even despite all of its shortcomings and the challenges that they've encountered, like that they're excited to continue developing for the watch. So we can't look at this experience now as a permanent, like, as a downer, like, oh man, this device sucks because the apps are terrible and they're slow, whatever. Like, because developers aren't looking at it that way, and things are going to change. It's just kind of, it's this early adopter, like, speed bump, right, that we're all kind of hitting right now.
What's interesting to me is, that the Apple Watch UI is a little bit complicated for new users. I think people are not going to intuitively turn it on and go, okay, I get it. I understand everything there is to know about this. I mean, just the idea, the first day I got my watch, it took me a while to figure out that you needed to force touch on the notifications to clear all of them, right? Yeah. These are things that are essential to the way that you use your watch. But even Android Wear has this tutorial every time you turn on a new watch or you reset it. And I mean, after a while it gets boring, but it's really useful to new users. Yeah. Apple's sort of relying on these guides, these guided tours that they've hosted online or in the Apple Watch app on the iPhone to overcome those issues. But I just wonder whether an onboarding experience on the watch itself would have been a little bit more intuitive for people.
I definitely think it could have been, or even within the watch app, say after you pair your watch, it goes through this tutorial on the phone and you can kind of follow along on your own watch as you're going. Something like that even, I think, would have been a little bit better, because there is no explanation as to the UI and where you find your notifications and where you find glances. I mean, a lot of that, they don't discuss a lot of that after you pair your watch. I think they're hoping that you're going to go into a store and check them out, and then the blue shirts will have a chance to show you around it, or there's, they've got this virtual setup program that you can do either in store or online, but not everyone's going to do that. And, I agree with you. I mean, after a week, I've gotten pretty used to the whole UI paradigm and where everything's located. I still don't really like the app launcher. I feel like that doesn't make a ton of sense on a watch, and I wish there was a different, more intuitive way to get into apps. Like, right. Glances sort of work if you pull them up and use them almost as an app launcher. You can get something at a glance and then tap it to jump into the full app, but not every app has a glance, and you're not going to want every app's glance like shown up in your glances screen. So I feel like there's a better way to interact with apps or get to apps. Maybe it's pulling things up contextually, like based on where you are or what you're doing, similar to Google Now, where it kind of just knows what apps you might need and displays those to you in a certain way. I mean, that's always been a challenge for Apple because they just simply don't have the amount of data on you that Google does. I mean, Google has your email and your calendar, and they can pull all that stuff up based on what they know about you. And Apple just doesn't have all of that information. But it does, the whole home screen and the teeny tiny icons and everything just feels a little out of place to me on the watch.
I wonder, and I'm guessing this will never happen for competitive reasons, but I wonder whether, because Google offers its search app on the iPhone, and it's actually a pretty good approximation of what Google Now is on an Android phone. I mean, it's still hidden within an app and it doesn't have system level access, but you still get notifications for things. You can still sort of go through the same cards that are synced through your Google account as you would on an Android phone or an Android Wear watch. And I just wonder whether they could ever update their iPhone app to support Apple Watch and give you a sort of a toned down Google Now experience on your watch using an app, or whether they would even want to do that.
This is something that I've been thinking about since widgets were announced for iOS 8, right? The Today widgets. I always thought that Google Now would make a fantastic iOS widget because you could essentially then have system-wide access to Google Now like it is on Android Wear. I don't know if that's something that Apple would ever allow or something that Google would ever want to do. But I feel like the watch, I mean, with glances, so you could essentially replicate a Google Now experience in glances. So if Gmail had a glance, if Google Maps had a glance, if even the Google app itself could have some kind of glance that would show. So you would essentially have different Google Now cards that you could swipe through on your watch. They could release a watch app that would let you scroll through Google Now cards like you can on the phones or on Android Wear. I think Google could do it. I think it's a question of whether Google would want to or whether Apple would allow it. I don't see Apple disapproving the app. I mean, they've let it on the iPhone, so I don't see why they wouldn't allow Google to do it for the watch. I think it's a question of whether Google wants to.
Yeah, I mean, I think the only way Apple would ever shut it down is if it replicated core, parts of the.
If it had a clock face, basically.
Right, but I mean, more than that, I just think that if they were, it would be sort of like those old time app developers trying to overcome the App Store guidelines by basically putting what amounted to a bunch of different apps inside a single app. So you would have, things like a clock and an RSS reader and things all within sort of a dashboard app on the iPhone. I know that was popular when the iPad first came out, and then Apple basically just shut it down. It was like, this is just recreating core parts of the OS.
Yeah. Well, they've gotten better with that, though. I mean, there was a period where Apple wasn't allowing third-party podcast apps, third-party email clients, third-party calendars. I mean, they wouldn't, anything that was a replacement for a system-level app on iOS, they would reject from the store. And they've gotten a lot better about that. They've also, I mean, they've approved all of Google's apps on iOS so far, Maps and Gmail and Weather and News or whatever apps Google has these days. So I feel like as long as it fit within, and I mean, there's weather apps already on the watch. There's RSS readers on the watch. There's I don't think there's any other map application yet, but I guess Google probably couldn't do maps with the current watch kit limitations, but maybe further down the line.
I mean, I think that they only have access to their own, to the Maps API or the
Apple
Kit
Maps
version Maps API. Yeah. It's interesting because with all the rumors of Google bringing iOS support to Android Wear, you'd think that they just want Google services to be on as many devices as they can get them. So, I would venture. I mean, I don't find glances to be particularly useful, but largely for the same reasons that I don't find apps to be useful on the watch. Glances just take too long to load as well, and the UI is made up as such that often while a glance is loading, you can't actually tell what it is until it's reloaded. Yeah,
until it's showing something.
Yeah. So unlike an app, it doesn't give you even the name of the app when it's loading. It's just blank,
right?
Which I find super unhelpful. I mean, there's a bit of carelessness in some of the UI that I think will probably be overcome in the next couple of versions. Somebody pointed out the fact that the calendar app doesn't let you go back and forth between months. So on April 30th, if you had an event on May 1st, you couldn't actually go and check what was on May 1st.
Wow, really? I never actually noticed that because I haven't used the calendar app very much, but that's kind of weird.
And I find that really kind of frustrating, but also just one of those sort of, okay, well, that's a .1 update. That's definitely going to come out in the next month or so. I also wonder whether, and I don't know if you've heard anything, but are the watch updates going to come with iOS updates, or are they going to be independent?
So the way that it's set up as of now looks like they could be independent because there is a section in the Apple Watch app for software updates. So it does look like they could push out Apple Watch or watchOS software updates independent of iOS updates. From what we can gather, the watchOS is based on iOS. So the watch is running some variation of iOS 8.2, whereas the phone is now on 8.3. So I don't think it's too much of a stretch to imagine that they could bundle some together at some point. But I think they've probably structured it in a way where they could push out incremental updates to the watch without a major iOS update or even a 0.1.1 update or something for iOS. And I think they want to probably increment on the watch a little quick or at the beginning at least, you know, for the next, I wouldn't be surprised if we see a couple of watch updates, maybe even before Dub Dub.
You know what's interesting too is I just thought, you know, everybody thinks that Apple updates for iOS happen, you know, sort of magically, and that they all roll out at the same time across the world without any carrier input. But I was told that that's not actually the case, that Apple gets quality assurance from every carrier that they have deals with. It's just that they sort of expedite the process. They say, okay, we're pushing out an app update on May 1st. You can put it through your tests, but you have 24 hours to do so. And we're going to push it out regardless of whether you approve it or not. But they do give the carriers all warning. But you know, remember what happened with 8? Was it 801 where it bricked a couple of the new iPhone 6?
Yeah.
Or was it 8.1? No, it was 801. So
it was 801 or 802 or something like that, where people installed it and it broke cellular functionality, which was like a major, you know.
I talked to a Bell rep, not a Bell rep, a Bell executive off the record about that, and he said that Apple basically did not apologize for that at all. They just sort of did their thing and was like, you know what, sometimes like shit happens. But they said, he said rather that the carrier never really has time to do the same kind of thorough quality control testing as they do on Android, because the carrier is the endpoint for Android. The carrier pushes it out, and same with Windows Phone, and I believe BlackBerry as well. But Apple pushes out the update themselves. They just give the carriers a day or so of warning, and they're like, okay, well, you know, hopefully nothing goes wrong.
Right. Well, which is such it's such a typical Apple approach, right? They're going to go to the carriers and say, look, we are releasing iOS 8 on whatever it is, September 9th, September 12th. Regardless of whether, I mean, you can test it. Like they've got, in theory, the entire beta period, the same amount of time as developers, right? To test. I mean, cellular carriers could download the iOS betas, put it on phones, test it throughout the entire time and send feedback to Apple, I'm sure. But they've worked it where Apple has the final say on the deadline for that, right? Apple's releasing it this day, whether you like it or not. Whereas Android has been the opposite. It's like, okay, here's the software, carriers test it, and as soon as it's good, like, we'll release it. And that's just the way that Apple operates, though, is like, we're not going to let anyone else dictate to us when we're going to launch our product. Like, we're launching it when we want to launch it. We'll give you what you need to test it, but it might not be, you know, enough time or whatever. Like, we're launching it anyway.
Yeah. And I mean, there are obviously advantages and disadvantages to that strategy, and the big disadvantage is what happens with 801, where you brick like 5 million people's phones temporarily and force them to restore them in iTunes.
I do, even if they never apologized for that, which I think is hilarious. I have to imagine that somebody got fired for that. Somebody at Apple.
Yeah, I mean, they apologized to the users, and that's really who they affected. Right. But what I was going to say about before I told that story was, the reason I find it interesting is that the Apple Watch does not need to go through any of that quality testing from the carrier perspective. So they can sort of iterate on this very quickly if they wanted to, and they could release hot fixes within a day or so. And similar to the way that Google controls the Android Wear stack, independent of the carriers, right? I find it interesting that Apple, as reliant as it is on the iPhone, it can still be a completely different upgrade process
for the watch.
But I mean, we're going to get to the point where, okay, so first generation Apple Watches won't work with iOS 10, and second gen will, or what happens when the second generation watch, does that no longer work with the iPhone 5? Or will it only work with the iPhone 5 on iOS 9? But if you stay on 8, the second generation watch won't work. Like, it adds this whole other layer of incompatibility potential when there's two independent operating systems that will have dependencies, right? So you have
Yeah.
the phone, you have the phone software, you have the watch hardware, and then you have the watch software. There's 4 variables that need to be taken into consideration
Right.
when you're thinking about potential software upgrades.
I think they're just going to have to kind of draw a line, like an imaginary sort of line in the sand, right? Even if this version of the watch software will support this iPhone hardware, like they're going to have to line things up in a way where they'll just have to cut it off, regardless of whether they could make it work or whether it does work or whatever. They'll have to put a label on, like, this is what we're officially supporting, or this is what officially is going to work, and just kind of line things up. Because you're right, there's a ton of variables and possibilities there. Like, when the watch gets updated to some form of iOS 9, like, will it get updated at the same time as iOS 9 hits the phones and the tablets, or will it fall behind, or will it still be running 8? Like, yeah, there's a lot of little intricacies with how this software is going to work. Work there.
It's really interesting. I mean, it's similar to the sort of situation in Android, right? Where Fitbit, for example, didn't release Android support until there was a Bluetooth stack embedded in the OS, which was in Android 4.3. And they were only adding support for particular devices on a test-by-test basis. So they would get a Galaxy S5 in, they would test it, okay, they'd release an update that supported it. And it's the same idea with mobile payments, right? In Canada, you have all these variables. You have the carrier, you have the smartphone manufacturer, you have the bank that needs to support it. So you have these situations where, okay, I'm on Bell, but I'm a TD customer with an Xperia Z3. Okay, crap, I can't use that, right? It's like, eventually, with enough iterations on hardware, it's good. We're going to be in that same situation with the Apple Watch.
Right. I have to imagine I think they'll do it based on the hardware and just cut things off. Like, the Apple Watch 2 will only work with 6 and above, or they'll cut it off based on, I think, the model names, and just bake in software compatibility depending on what they want it to be compatible with, I think. Just to keep things simple. But I am intrigued by the possibility, like you mentioned, that I hadn't even thought about, was that they could iterate on the watch software quite a bit faster and quite a bit more frequently than they can with the phone, because there's less risk in terms of disabling things like cellular radios that are kind of important to the functionality of a smartphone.
Right.
There's less partners that they have to, they don't have to send the software out to carriers to get tested, or to like all around the world to make sure that things are going to work, right? They can roll out a watch update. They could do it on a nightly basis if they wanted to, and everything would work as long as they've tested it internally.
I'm sure they are.
I think that's great. Like, I wouldn't be surprised if we see a watch update in the next couple of weeks, just to address some of these early bugs, the launch bugs. They've already said they're trying to work on making apps faster and that kind of stuff. So it'll be interesting to see if the watch software grows faster than, or is released on a more frequent basis than iOS is, because iOS 8 has gotten a lot more updates, I think, than the last couple of versions have. So would be nice to see the watch software progress a little faster.
It's interesting. A lot of people said that iOS 8 was done with 8.3, but we've seen a beta release for 8.4.
Yeah.
And DubDub is what, a month from now? Like a month and 6 weeks, less than 6 weeks. So, we'd assume that on, the day one of the keynote, they're going to release an iOS 9 beta. So I'm guessing iOS 8.4 would either need to be released that day, or like they may still iterate on iOS 8 as they roll out iOS 9 betas, right? They may also have a sort of a technical preview the same way as they're doing it with OS X, where they have like a more stable, like a public beta for iOS 9.
Yeah. 8.4, which is their main inclusion for that, I guess, is the new music app, right? So if the streaming service that they're rumored to be working on is ready in time, I think 8.4 that would be a big announcement. If at WWDC 8.4 was ready, like if they released 8.4 that day with this new streaming service that they've been working on, all ahead of iOS 9, I think that would be great. I think that's probably, with 8.4 being in beta already, I think that's kind of the path that we're headed on. Like that's kind of the likely outcome in my opinion. But if the streaming service isn't ready and that comes with iOS 9, I don't know. 8.4 is a weird thing.
Yeah, and what's interesting to me is my guess, and here's my prediction for WWDC. With the refresh of the Apple TV, there's going to be a big emphasis on this sort of Beats music rebrand on everything. So we're going to have like a lean back version of it that debuts on the Apple TV. There's going to be, I think, a big demonstration of that product on stage in all of its iterations, right? So all the way from the watch to the phone to the tablet to the screen. And I think that they're really going to push this Beats, whatever they end up calling it, Beats music, refresh. And I think that's going to play a big part of their kind of 2015 strategy.
Yeah. I honestly, I think that's going to. I think the music service will roll out at WWDC. I don't think that's going to be part of iOS 9. I don't think they're waiting for the fall for that. If they do this Apple TV refresh, like you said, I think it's going to be the Beats thing will be everywhere, and I think that'll be their big like, here's this thing, it's ready now, we're releasing this today, and then the rest of the stuff obviously is coming out in the fall. I could totally see that. I think that's what they're heading towards.
It's amazing to me that the iPhone 6 is already like 8 months old.
Mine still feels new. I still look at it all the time and go like, oh, this iPhone just came out.
But it is weird, right? Like it's interesting that September, and I'm just thinking about like the number of phones that have come out since then. Like I traveled to New York this week for the LG G4 announcement, and all these phone releases keep getting earlier and earlier in the year, right, to distance themselves further and further from Apple. I mean, clearly there's a 6-month point where you're either closer to the previous launch or you're closer to the upcoming launch. But there's, as I think we're right now sort of at that 5-month mark. But LG just put out its new or announced its new G4. And what's interesting is that clearly these companies have taken Apple's camera dominance to heart, and they are trying to differentiate themselves no longer with like speeds and feeds, but by camera performance, right? So LG and Samsung have really emphasized the fact that their respective flagship cameras are the best, better than iPhone. I did some testing with the S6 and the iPhone 6, and I'm going to do the same with the G4. But in many ways, I think that they're getting close, if they haven't surpassed them already.
Yeah, I have not read up a ton on the G4, but from what I've seen in terms of camera tests and some of the test shots that some journalists have been tweeting and posting online, it is seriously impressive to me. Like, I think I saw one that you posted from Build, that you took a photo of the keynote stage with the G4, and that was an amazing looking photo. I mean, there are times where I look at my iPhone and go like, why can't you take pictures that look like that? Like, I think some of these phones are really getting, and that's, for so long it was this weird like megapixel war, and I can't believe that. What is the iPhone still at 8 megapixels?
It is, yeah.
Compared to some of these Android phones that are at like 12 and 16 and 40 something if you look at HTC or whatever. Well,
no, that's 20. But I mean, like, what's interesting is that megapixels really don't make a difference
not at all.
In the performance. iPhone has continued to sort of push the idea that larger pixels are more important than the number of megapixels. I do think, though, that with the GS6 and the G4, we're getting to this point where the sensors are 1/2.6 inches. So they're actually larger sensors than the iPhone 6, which is 1/3.06. But the size of the individual pixels is still smaller than the iPhone 6. So the iPhone 6 is 1.5 micrometers, or it's micrometers, right?
Sure,
I forget
believe
my nomenclature. And the Galaxy S6 and LG G4 are 1.2. So the individual pixels are significantly smaller, but there's double the number of pixels in the sensor. So what we have is higher spatial resolution, where you have a much higher resolution photo, but we're also getting to the point now where the larger lenses, the sharper lenses, letting in more light, allowing those sensors to work a little bit less hard to compensate. So, and you have things like optical image stabilization, which the iPhone 6 doesn't, but the iPhone 6 Plus does. So, there's a lot of interesting things here. And if you, if you take a look at the trend that this is moving in, I really am impressed with just the amount of detail you can capture and the nuance that you can capture with a smartphone camera today.
Yeah. I mean, I look back a couple years and think about the fact that, when I got the iPhone 4 and how blown away I was by the fact that I could take essentially point and shoot quality photos with my iPhone. And people would, I'd post pictures on Facebook all the time, and people would say like, man, I can't believe this was taken like with your phone. And that was just 2010. I mean, you look at how far smartphones have come in terms of camera functionality just in the last 4 and 5 years. It's insane. And some of these phones now with like the low light capability and 4K video and things like that, it's gotten seriously impressive.
I mean, there is a side effect of having such a wide aperture. F1.8 is great in theory, but it actually gives you some depth of field that you may not want. So, you don't really have the same. You can sort of lower the aperture, but it doesn't really work because it is a fixed aperture. So they sort of have to compensate using focus.
Right.
But when you're taking a foreground photo of a foreground subject with the Galaxy S6 and the G4, everything in the background is blurry, whether you want it to be or not. So it's giving you that sort of artistic effect, but you don't have a choice in the matter. Whereas the iPhone 6 with its f2.2 lens finds a balance. You can get some serious depth of field, but you also you don't have to have that depth of field all the time.
Right.
So
what did you think of the G4 beyond the camera in terms of like the hardware? As a phone, what did you think of it?
Yeah, I mean, I'm surprised. I had a lot of criticisms of the G3. A lot of it had to do with the screen and the software. I found the software to be really, they basically took iOS 7, as all Android manufacturers did, and sort of tried to make it Android.
Right.
But they didn't do a great job at it. There were a lot of translation errors that I really found frustrating. A lot of subtle things like spacing, where text would go right up to the edge of a box that you would have to tap on all the time. The notification shade was really just ugly. Like every part of the UI that they tried to overhaul just ended up being it ended up looking better but functioning worse.
Right.
So LG's taken time this year to sort of figure out what was working and what wasn't. The phone feels a lot nicer. I don't have the leather version. I have the ceramic dark version, but it feels a lot nicer in the hand. It's a lot easier to grip. The screen's amazing. The screen is like, it's a 5.5-inch QHD display, but it's just fucking amazing. Like I cannot put it in any clearer terms. Like it's just beautiful. And the camera's great. So everything that I criticize with on the G3 has been addressed in the G4 and then some.
That's good. And so what was the situation with the leather back? Is it actual leather or is it like Samsung faux leather?
No, it is leather, and they give you a bunch of options. Only one of them is coming to Canada. It's the black leather, but they had a sort of a tan leather. They had a red leather, yellow, the black one, and I believe they had a white one. But I don't know. I don't think they did. So the leather feels great. It's vegetable tan, so it should hold up better than a lot of sort of quickly chemically treated leathers. And they went on a whole spiel in our briefing about this, about how they took like 3 years to source the right leather producer and to find the right techniques and to create this beautiful German stitching that nobody else uses. And they took some shots at Motorola, and then, it was like, you're playing with the with the, you know, the real kings here, like don't mess with us kind of thing.
So this is going to be like, you know, because this is also sounding like the way that Johnny talks about the watch leather. So is this going to be the new like pissing match between tech companies? Is how the quality of the leather that they're using for and how many years they spent crafting it and choosing just the right colors and things for their devices? This is going to be like the new megapixel war.
I guess they have to, right? Because materials are still, it's still an arms race when it comes to materials. And I think that's what we, you know, everything else on the high end smartphone has commoditized to the point where it's really difficult to differentiate. So when you can offer a suite of leather backs and, you know, say they charge $50 each, but, you know, some carriers throw in an extra leather case or an extra leather back if you really want to, you know, be generous. These are ways that, you know, carriers can sort of differentiate the G4 from the S6 and the iPhone 6. LG can differentiate it in its marketing material. If you damage the back, you can just replace it, which is really nice because you can on the Moto X. But it's also just it's a nice way of sort of saying, okay, we hear you. We want it, you know, customers don't want slippery, gross plastic, but we don't think that metal and glass are going to hold up over time. So here's the next best alternative.
Yeah. Interesting. It's nice. I think it looks nice, I guess. I like the leather case I have for my phone. So if it was built in, I guess I wouldn't have any complaints.
That's kind of the way I see it. I really like the leather case on the iPhone 6. I have a Moto Maker version of the Moto X that has a black leather on the back, and it's held up really well. You know, it takes your finger oils and scratches, and it sort of just like infuses it into the leather itself, and it gives it more character. It doesn't make it uglier. It just makes it nicer over time.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And I'm hoping that this kind of ages the same way. I'll have to bug Motorola Canada to send me a leather back to test, but in the meantime, we're approaching an hour and a half, so I think we're gonna.
I know. I like how you didn't say during the podcast that you wanted to keep it short, but that is always the curse. Is when you at the beginning, if you say, "Oh, it's going to be a short one," it never ends up being a short one. So
no, I think, you know what, I said that at the beginning, and then once we got started, I was like, you know what. When you and I podcast, I'm just going to go for the hour and a half from now on.
Yeah, I mean, we could make this a 2-parter. It could be a special event series.
I would think nobody would listen to that second part except you and me.
Well, I hope the people that do listen enjoy our hour and a half.
Well, I mean, yeah, let's try to do this every week. I think that we're going to do we'll brand the SyrupCast this week, but then we'll do a regular Apple focused podcast every week, because
for sure,
why the hell not? I think there's enough to talk about, and
I like it. I'm game. Why the hell not?
All right, so everybody, thank you for listening, and let us know your feedback. If you're an Apple user, did you enjoy it? If you're a Samsung user, was this too much Apple? I know, or an Android user. I know the answer to that question, but
yeah, I was going to say, now you're just asking for it.
Anyway, thank you again for listening, and we will see you next week. Thanks, Eric, for joining us.
Thank you.